Good afternoon, all of you. So, where were we in the last class?
Semantic barrier.
Supposed to, did we finish chapter 2, communication?
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry?
Yes, ma'am. Chapter 2 was completed.
Okay. Now, this is, have we also done barriers to communication?
Yes, ma'am. Up to semantic.
Okay. Uh, the next barrier is perceptual barrier. Because we all see the world differently. So we have our own individual point of view and we perceive things differently from one another. Now, this becomes a barrier in understanding each other's point of view. Uh, for example, the word terrorist. Now, the word terrorist is has a lot of meaning for a lot of people. Some believe that they are terrorists. Some believe they are freedom fighters, and a section of the media believe that they deliberately write militants. Now, militants are not the same as terrorists. So, shame. So we see the world differently. Our perception about the events in the world are different. Now, this creates a barrier because we fail to understand each other's point of view. So, the lack of common approaches to understanding and interpreting things eventually leads to misunderstanding and at times to violence. Now, having different point of view is not a crime. We are all we all have a right to uh, our subjective opinion, our individual perception. But what creates the miscommunication or communication barrier is uh, the lack of common approaches in understanding certain things and interpreting certain things. And it becomes worse when this misunderstanding leads to violence. So perceptual barrier, as in the case of that video of the two kids, the Israeli and the Palestinian kid. So the Israelis feel that they have a rightful claim on Israel. Sorry, the Jewish feel that they have a rightful claim on Israel because that is they are reclaiming their lost land, while the Palestinians think that the Israelis are occupying their their state. So perceptual differences, how we see things, how we react to certain things. So for some of us, we go on to justify certain political leaders, whereas many others would not justify. Uh, Now, physical is one of the most important factors in building cohesive team. So, in workplaces, proximity is important. So, if you don't sit together, you cannot create a cohesive team. So, for teamwork to go well, you have to be together physically. So, when there is no physical proximity, the team is disrupted. So physical distances ruin our prospect of working in teams or collaborating. So we should always focus more on building work areas free of walls and closed doors. So these days, you go find big corporates, you find Apple or Google offices are free of walls. There are no walls. So all of them sit together and work. They have their own space to work, but they work in a cohesive way. They sit in proximity. There are no walls and that divide them. So so workplaces are becoming more and more favorable to cohesive team building. They are free of walls and closed doors. Even some architects promote the idea of having open houses where where you don't have closets. I came across some article where it said that the latest trend today is of doing interiors is uh, having transparent closets. So you display everything that's there in. You don't have anything to hide. There are a lot of philosophy, there are a lot of ideology and ideas that work behind all this. But the thing is, when we are working in a team, it's very important that we stay together. That proximity is important, physical proximity. You might have you might have faced problems while having while building teams and preparing for your face off. It would not have been a very challenging task had you done that inside the classroom where you see each other, where you would work with each other, where you would be physically close to your friends. So physical proximity is important, it's necessary for cohesive team building. And if it's not there, so physical barriers. That's also a barrier in communication. Next is physiological. Physiological is sometimes we don't have the requisite state of mind to listen to what the speaker is saying because of certain physiological conditions, certain bodily processes that interfere with reception of messages. For example, if the speaker has a headache or flu, or if the audience are hungry, feeling sleepy and sloppy. So, these conditions, these physiological conditions, may interfere with transmission of message and message accuracy. So, that's physiological noise, physiological barriers. Psychological is it refers to your mental state or emotional state that impedes or that uh, stops message transmission or reception. For example, if someone has just broken up with a significant other, or if you're worried about your grandmother who is in the hospital, or if you're thinking about your shopping list, all this may interfere with communication processes as well because this is what we call physically present and mentally absent. So, if you're preoccupied mentally, you're there in the class, but then you simply mute and leave. So this hinders this this interferes with the communication process. Or maybe you are physically there in the classroom, but you're preoccupied about and thinking something else. So that's psychological noise, psychological barrier. Then the actual physical noise, and this is the actual sound in the room. So if you're playing loud music, if there's lawnmower, if people are shouting or there's construction going on outside. So this is actual physical noise, and this interferes with communication as well because you cannot hear what the other person is saying because of loud noise outside. So this is actual physical noise. We talked about two kinds of physical noise. One is the actual physical noise, in the sense that the denotative sense of physical noise, where there is actual noise. And then we also talked about uh, physical noise in the sense of physical proximity with our team members. And both of them interferes with communication processes. Next is interpersonal. So one of the key barriers in interpersonal relationship is poor listening. Very simple. So there are a list of interpersonal barriers, communication barriers. One of them is poor listening, and this is predominantly the major barriers in interpersonal relationship. One of them is speaking, the other one doesn't listen. This is a barrier. So your friend is saying something and you don't listen, or your parent, one of your parents saying something, you don't listen. That's poor listening, and this is detrimental to interpersonal relationship. It is one of the barriers to interpersonal relationship. The others being communication selectivity. The other interpersonal communication barrier is communication selectivity. Now, this means that I only listen to part of your speech or to part of your conversation that I want to listen, that I intend to listen, and I leave the rest out. So I'm not interested in listening to the entire discourse, entire conversation. I listen to simply that part which I intend to listen. Like I had a professor in my university who used to go to listen to lectures, and he would listen for the first 10 minutes and jot down 5 questions for discussion in the later half, and then he would switch off. He would not listen. Okay, so that's called communication selectivity. I only listen to part of the communication that interests me, or I'm interested in, or I intend to listen, and I don't listen to the whole communication. This can also be read as listening to something which suits you. I listen to only that part which suits me, which is very conducive and convincing for me. But I don't listen to anything else. That is also communication selectivity. So I listen to only what is conducive, what sounds good for me. But something which doesn't match, corroborate to my ideology, I don't listen. That is communication selectivity, and it happens with most of us, I guess. Most of us have these kind of barriers with us. We sometimes get into poor listening in classroom, especially. You simply switch off. I'm not talking about gadgets, but you switch off your mind because listening doesn't happen through ears; it happens through mind. So you switch off your mind. You don't listen. That is poor listening. And most of the time, there is also communication selectivity. Something that impressed me, something that is convincing, something that I want to hear, I would. Something which is quite opposite to what I believe, to my conviction, I don't. No, this uh, I personally experience this communication selectivity also. If something is doesn't or is not quite convincingly presented, or if something uh, uh, if something goes beyond my ideology, then I don't listen. So I'm also a victim of communication selectivity, especially in the case of news channels. So I really never switch on NDTV because I don't like listening to the crap that NDTV propagates. So that's communication selectivity, maybe. I don't know, but might be. Yeah. Emotional outbursts. Emotional outburst is another interpersonal uh, barrier. Because when two people are talking and one of them um, bursts out emotionally, cries, shouts, screams, then communication stops. So when volume increases, uh, the content or the message stops, communication stops. So when you increase your volume, communication stops there. So emotional outburst is also an interpersonal uh, barrier. Both of you are talking and one of them starts screaming and shouting and not listening to you, then you're helpless. Or you also start shouting at the same pitch. That's also one emotion, one barrier to interpersonal relationship communication. Then is incongruity of verbal and non-verbal message. This is pertinent in classroom situations, or maybe when you say something, but non-verbally you mean something else. For example, I mean, your verbal and non-verbal message do not match. They don't corroborate. That is incongruity. There's no congruence between your verbal and non-verbal message. So sometimes happens is when I ask in the classroom, so how did you find the class? So, uh, you yawn, you look at the watch and you say, the class was quite interesting. So verbally you say that the class was interesting, but non-verbally you mean that you were quite bored, you wanted the class to end because you're looking at your watch very constantly, you're yawning repeatedly, so your non-verbal gestures suggest something else, whereas your verbal message says something else, and both of them don't match. So there's incongruence, there's incongruities, there's no congruence, there's no match between your verbal and your non-verbal message. So that's also a major barrier to interpersonal communication. So people also tend to distance themselves through different social pastimes and games too. People you see in interpersonal communication, people are in most of the time people are not genuinely interested in a good communication. Just to avoid communicating, they're involved in games. So we play games, we are involved in other pastimes because we don't want to communicate. That is also a barrier. Social pastimes, partying and partying and watching movies and all this are and games, playing games. These are moving moving out of some really deep and candid conversations. Only because we don't want to get into candid and deep conversations, we get into pastimes and games. And these very rhetorical social interactions. Hi, hello, how are you? How's your doing? And sometimes they are not very genuine. They are rhetorical. uh, because we just want to pass on these questions and then dismiss the entire conversation. So interpersonal communication are hindered by these factors, by the factor of not listening carefully, poor listening, by being communication selective, by selecting what you would like to hear and what not, emotional outbursts, screaming, shouting, crying. Someone is trying to explain you something and then you start screaming all of a sudden, shouting. Communication doesn't take place like that. Then there are, it is very childish, but there were usually girls, and they used to scream for no other reason than so you just fail to make them understand your point of view. So then incongruity of verbal and non-verbal message. When your verbal and non-verbal message do not match, that's a major barrier because people look for both the cues. People are listening to what you're saying and also looking at what you mean. So this is a very tricky situation and a very significant barrier. Your credibility. If your verbal and non-verbal messages do not match, then people feel that you're probably deceiving them. You are a liar. So both of them should match. And then social pastimes, rhetorical, conversational tools and games, they all become an excuse for not having a good conversation. So these that they also act as major communication barriers. Then limited vocabulary, like we were discussing about connotative and denotative meanings yesterday. So um, if you're not a native speaker, you fail to understand the deeper meanings of certain phrases and terms. That happens with English, that happens with any other language. There are a lot of nuances of a language. So if you are not into the regular habit of communicating in the language, you fail to notice. So, limited vocabulary. If I don't understand certain things and they speak, then maybe uh, maybe I don't understand. I am very um, poor in the technical jargons and technical registers and words. So if you give me a 15-minute lecture on Java or other computer language, then I'll seriously have problems because I have a limited vocabulary on that. I really don't understand. And uh, I must also understand the connotative meaning, because you get the denotative meaning in dictionaries, but you would not get the connotative meaning to certain words, the culturally acquired meaning of words in a particular language. So if you don't understand the connotative meaning of certain words, um, then it also becomes difficult. Like, uh, like the Americans would say, we're going to bury the Russians. So now, bury here doesn't literally mean bury. That's a connotative use or an idiomatic use of the term bury. But for that, you need to have a little bit of grasp of the language. Any language in fact, Hindi, Odia, anything. There are a lot of idiomatic usage, and you need to understand that. Then comes yeah, we were talking about this. So, nonverbal communication enhances and enlivens verbal communication, but misinterpreting acts as a major barrier. So, if you're not sure about the nonverbal gestures, you tend to misinterpret. Uh, and also sometimes both of them don't go together. Now, emotional outburst, as we were discussing, is when volume becomes louder than message. Communication fails in that case. Now, coming to intrapersonal barriers. Intrapersonal barriers are barriers which hold within us, which lie within us. So, intra means I, I. So, it has to do something with me or with the speaker. So, intrapersonal barriers are one is wrong assumptions. When wrong assumptions is the belief that the world is centered around I, me, and myself. So whatever I think, whatever I believe is the right thing, and others should also think as I think or I believe. So that is uh, wrong assumption. I, me, myself. Next is varied perceptions, which means friend who are closer seems correct. For example, two friends, they have an argument, or they have a fight, and they go to the third person, and the third person is closer to communicator A than communicator B. So the third person will definitely support communicator A because uh, he or she is closer to her, and the friend or the people who are closer to us seem correct. We always we we uh, we always take the sides of people who are closer to us, and we even sometimes tend to ignore the real picture or the real story. We always say yes, yes, he's correct, and the hidden fact is that because he's closer to me, I will support him. That's valid perceptions. Next, and that's a barrier because we don't listen to the story from all sides of it, from all the perceptions, from all the perspectives. We need to understand what has happened, but we don't, and we favor people who are closer to us. So that's a barrier, and that's an intrapersonal barrier. That is a barrier that lies within me. Now, differing backgrounds. To understand the background of our audience, we have to identify, we have to be empathic to our audience. There will be multiple people from multiple backgrounds, people from different religion, people from different ethnicity, of different color, different educational background, socio-economic background. So we have to have an understanding, we have to have an empathy towards them so as to understand them. And when we don't empathize with our audience, we when we fail to understand their background, uh, it is we also fail to understand why they are behaving, they are acting, or they are communicating in a certain way as they are. So for that, we need to understand their background. We have to be empathetic listeners, and we have to identify with our audience because all of us have our own. Uh, we have different backgrounds. We come from different backgrounds, psychological, demographic. All our backgrounds are different. But the key to unleashing good communication is to have an empathy, to share empathy, or to be empathetic to our audience. Then is wrong inferences, what actually exists and what we assume. The typical case of being misconstrued. or having wrong inferences is something that has actually happened, but we presume that this might have happened. Uh, because of, so, for example, the uh, okay, for example, you see Sudhanshu walking with a girl on the lane, and then you go and create stories. So you don't even give Sudhanshu a chance to explain that. No, this is not the case. You start creating stories. Now, that's wrong inference. What actually might have happened, but what we assume has happened. The other intrapersonal barrier is prejudices. We have our own biases, and all of us suffer with biases. We have our prejudices, we have our biases, we have our own share of stereotyping. So that's also an intrapersonal barrier, and uh, we have our own notions about certain things, and we still have. The problem is, in spite of all the readings, in spite of all the exposure, we still have our own prejudices. Uh, okay, I think this should have come for okay, communication selectivity is what we have already done. As a receiver, we listen partially to the message. That's breaking the communication process, as we discussed. Cultural variation is we have to overcome the communication inadequacies arising from different language and culture. That's important. So we have to overcome uh, the communication inadequacies because of different language, different culture. There will be a lot of cultural variations, and we have to work on it. Like I was saying yesterday about the notion of ethnocentrism, where we start believing that our own culture is best and others are not. The entire colonialist project was based on this, was based on the notion that we as a race, we as a people, we as a civilization are the best. We are superior because we are white in color. We are intellectually superior than the brown people and the black people. So we have a right to rule over them and to bring them to our fold. So the entire colonialist perspective of the project, the imperialist project, was based on the notion of racial superiority based on the primarily the color of the skin, only because they are white. They considered themselves intellectually and socially empowered or more powerful and superior than us. So they came. Trading was an excuse, but the other project that they had with trading was the missionary enterprise. There were a lot of missionaries who came along who wanted to convert us because they felt that we are religiously, intellectually quite inferior to them. So they are here to teach us civilization. That was the entire colonialist project. So, So we need to overcome these inadequacies arising from different language and culture. Now, poor listening is when we are distracted while listening. There's too much emotional disturbances or indifference and aggressiveness. Anything could be a reason, but we don't listen. The fact is, we don't listen. So this also creates major barriers. Now, uh, those who are listening to this uh, can tell me at least, uh, can identify some of the barriers that they have. Can you identify some of the barriers that you face while communicating? Yes, Sudhanshu and Swayam Jyoti,
Ma'am, noise.
that's the only barrier?
No, ma'am, one of it.
Okay. What are the other barriers that you can identify? What are the intrapersonal barriers that you have within that prevents proper communication? My question is that. So anyone is free to answer this.
Wrong assumption.
Emotional.
Okay, emotional in the sense you are preoccupied emotionally and don't listen. Is that what you mean to say?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yes. Any other any other uh, barriers, intrapersonal barriers?
Varied perceptions.
Okay. So what are your perceptions? Explain with me, which acts as a barrier. I'm asking about your own experience, about your own story, as to what, as to whether you can identify some of these barriers that that created some communication mishaps, communication problems. No? Okay. Now coming to measures to overcome barriers. Now communicate according to the need of the receiver. So the sender of the communication should prepare the structure of the message, not according to his or her own level or ability, but he should keep in mind the level understanding or the environment of the receiver. How much can the receiver perceive? How much can the receiver understand? So we have to take care of the need of the receiver, not how much we understand, not how much we perceive. We have to really understand or take care of the needs of our own audience. See if uh, I'm, I'm going to talk on Derrida and Buddhism, then I have a need for you to understand what Derrida said, what Buddhism is all about. So you don't have the need, and you possibly also don't have the comprehension ability to understand the terms. Or maybe if you go ahead and give me a lecture on or make me understand your computer languages, I'll fail to understand. That's because that's beyond my ability to understand the technical jargons, and I don't have the need also to learn a computer language. I have nothing to do with that. So you have to take care. So while delivering a speech, you have to understand the needs and the level of understanding, the ability of your audience before preparing a speech. Don't I mean don't you don't have to prepare a very high pitched sermon. Neither do you also have to bring in a very easy topic. So you have to understand the need and the level or the ability of your receiver. How much can they understand? The next one is to be aware of language, tone, and content of your message. So the sender should take care of the fact that the message should be framed in clear and beautiful language. The language should be clear. There has to be clarity. Don't make a lot of grammatical errors. Not excusable. So the language has to be clear. The idea should be presented in a very clear and vivid manner. The language should be beautiful in the sense that do not use hate language. Don't be too blunt and rude. The tone of the message should not injure the feelings of the receiver. So you should not be hurting the receiver to your language. So as far as possible, the contents of the message should be brief, uh, and excessive use of technical words should be avoided. Don't use lot of technical jargons, not necessary. If your audience is a layman, you have to also understand that your audience do not understand a lot of technical words, jargons. So better not use them. But if you're speaking for a specialized audience, then um, using technical jargons is all right. But if the audience is layman, if they don't understand a lot of technicalities or technical jargons, then preferably you must avoid using a lot of technical jargons. So we must take care of the language and the tone and the content. Three things, three factors of the message. Because when you encode your message, you encode it with language, and when you present it, your tone and content also comes in. So the language, tone, and content of your message should not be perpetuating threat, hurt, or offend. Should not be offensive. Should not offend the other person, and you may not also perpetuate hatred. So uh, and linguistically, it should be non-threatening, but the language should be error-free. We're not supposed to make a lot of errors when we write or speak. At least advanced level learners like us should make fewer and fewer language errors. That's required. But more importantly, your tone should be very warm, should not be offensive and blunt, and should not hurt people. And the content of your message should be something which the other person will quite clearly identify with, or quite clearly understand. So the key to communication is always being understood. So we must be a little conscious about how we design or codify our message. The language structure that we use, the tone that we are using when speaking, tone is very, very important. Now, tonality comes under non-verbal communication, but it it is a major meaning marker. So, meaning is not always perceived by the listener from your words or the language, but also more often by your tone. What is the tone you're using? Are you trying to disgrace the other person? Are you being disgraceful? Are you being humble? Are you being warm and friendly? Or are you being very matter of factly, blunt, straight? So, uh, so basically, your tone matters a lot. Whatever your language is, but your tone highlights the entire essence of your message. And tone should be moderate, should not be hurting people, and it should be very, very accommodative, very warm. So we must take care of these three factors, very, very, very important: language, tone, and content. Now, convey things of help and value to the listener. The subject matter of the message should be helpful to the receiver, as we were talking. The need and interest of the receiver should especially be kept in mind. So, communication is more effective in such a situation. So, when you are empathetic to your audience, when uh, when you try and understand and identify with your audience, uh, and when you try to recognize their needs, only then communication can be fruitful, communication can be meaningful. And while designing syllabuses, we one very significant area while designing syllabus is the need to understand the and identify the need of our audience. So most of the syllabuses these days in all the universities that you see is need-based syllabus. So we just try to identify, we just try to find out what is the need of our students, and accordingly we design the syllabus. Since this is a technical university and you are into the technical branch, critical thinking and public speaking were supposed to be one of the needs for technical. This critical thinking and public speaking is a prerequisite for all the graduates. But since the other universities, non-technical universities, offer literature and specialized language courses also. We have a literature, full-fledged literature course. We have English language teaching course. We have linguistics, and there are so many other courses: psychology, philosophy, sociology, political science. But those are not your needs. Those don't come under your purview. So we don't design syllabuses which you don't require. So need-based, learner-centric. That's the word, learner-centric syllabus. Now, the syllabuses that we design are learner-centric syllabus or need-based syllabus. What do our audience, what do our students require? What do they need? And accordingly, syllabuses are designed. So we have to understand the things that will help our our audience and that they can value. So the subject matter of your message should be helpful to the receiver. The need and interest of the receiver should be specially kept in mind because we are dealing with other people. This is communication. So we are dealing with someone else. There are two or more parties involved in communication. So it is not me only. Communication involves two or more people, and I have to understand the needs and the interest of my receiver. So the subject matter that is helpful, that is of value to my listener or my receiver should be the priority for the sender, for the communicator, and that makes communication more effective. So these are some of the measures to uh, overcome barriers. The other measure is to ensure proper feedback. This is very, very vital for any communicator. The purpose of feedback is to find out whether the receiver has properly understood the meaning of the information received. And in the face to face communication, the reaction on the face of the receiver can be understood. So we have to ensure that there is proper feedback. And in a face to face interaction, we read the gestures of our audience. So we get to know whether they have understood or they are not interested or they don't understand or it is not their priority, it's not their need. We get to know from their facial expression, from their body language. But that's not possible in case of written communication or other sort of communications. So for these type of communication, we have to ensure that there is a proper method of feedback that is adopted by the sender. We have to ensure that understanding has taken place, that comprehension has taken place. Okay, so that's the end of this unit. And if there is any question, anything that you'd like to ask, no question as usual. Uh, and I'm sure in the next lab, all of you will uh, systematically do your presentations, your debate in a sequence in a chronology. So all of you can do that. Yes. So uh, if there is any queries, and I hope to finish it off next week itself, so we don't linger your activity. Uh, who's your coordinator? Who's coordinating?
Anisa.
Sorry, you are coordinating, Sudhanshu?
Actually, Anisa is coordinating now, ma'am.
Uh, is she there in the class?
I don't know, ma'am. Let me check.
Yes. So please,
No, ma'am. She isn't in the class.
okay. So please try to finish it up in the upcoming lab, right? And so if you have no queries in this chapter, this is done. So barriers is done. And in the next class, we move on to the new chapter. Please remind me that we are due for the new chapter. And I'll mail you these PPTs. Yeah. Okay then. Thank you, all of you, and all of you. Please take care of yourself. Stay home and be safe. Okay. In most places of
Thank you, ma'am.
Odisha, we have a weekend lockdown, so we're not supposed to go out. But for other states, just don't go out unnecessarily and stay home and be safe. Okay. Thank you, all of you. I'll see you in the next class.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.